So hello everyone. Here we have Stephen Zoones, a professor of politics and international studies at the University of San Francisco. Hello, Dr. Zoones. Thank you for being with us and accepting our invitation.
Glad to be with you.
The main purpose of this interview was to educate Persian-speaking communities, especially people of Iran, about nonviolent actions and resistance against the regime. You may, I guess, be aware of the movements in Iran, and you already had written some articles. In the article that you sent the link to me, you mentioned the rule of nonviolent actions in the 1979 revolution. It was a little bit confusing for me, the role of nonviolent action in such a revolution, since there were actually violent moves from Islamists and the left group against the Shah, right? So from the years leading to the revolution and also during the revolution, also after the revolution until now. For example, there were assassinations to Shah and also to the Crown Prince, and also the incident of Cinema Rex, where people lives were set fire to, like around 470 to 500 got killed in that incident. And it was just a show to say that it was the work of Savak, which was not true. How do you explain or reconcile these violent actions with the broader narrative of nonviolent resistance?
Well, first of all, I just want to emphasize that when I talk about a nonviolent resistance in this context, I'm not talking about nonviolence as a pacifist ethos or a personal ethic. I'm looking at it as, in many ways, the ultimate asymmetrical warfare, where a population engages in various kinds of civil resistance to undermine the authority of what the people consider an illegitimate regime. So when I talk about nonviolence, it's not a moral judgment on people. I'm looking at it as a strategic analyst. And my study of movements against dictatorial regimes, anti-colonial struggles, and others, there are very, very few that are purely violent or purely nonviolent. That almost all such revolutions have been mixed. But when I talk about the use of civil resistance or nonviolent action, where I emphasize it, is where it appears to have been the decisive element. And when I talk about the use of nonviolent action against the Shah's regime, or for that matter, the Constitutional Revolution early in the last century, or other periods of civil resistance, the tobacco strike in the 1890s, and of course the more recent nonviolent campaigns against the Islamic Republic, I am looking at where the impact that they have had, and what brought down the Shah was not the scattered acts of violence and terrorism by MEK and some armed groups, and not those of the Islamists, but for example, it was the strikes by the oil workers, for example, and those in the customs union. And even the communication, workers, when the Shah would go on for a speech, suddenly the power would go off. And other forums that basically got the message to the Iranian people that despite the Shah's enormous accumulation of sophisticated weaponry purchased from the United States, despite the reach of the Savak and other government repression, that ultimately it was vulnerable through a massive non-cooperation. Now, if you look at similar uprisings against authoritarian rulers, most of them do end up with some form of the stable democratic government within 5 years. Others have ended up under new dictatorships. And we saw this most recently in Egypt, when Mubarak was brought down by a largely nonviolent movement, only to be replaced a few years later by Sisi and the current military dictatorship. And certainly this is what happened with Iran, that even though the methods used by the resistance, which was initially very broad-based. It wasn't just the Islamists. It included liberals, leftists, a big cross-section of the population. But in the power struggle that ensued, of course, the clerics and other hardline Islamists ended up dominating the government, purging their opponents, and of course all the horrors that the Iranian people have suffered since then. But so when I talk about use of nonviolent action, I'm looking at it as what was the primary tactic, the primary strategic emphasis, because the opposition, both Islamists and leftists and secular and nationalists and others who took part in the revolution in the late 70s, recognized that if they used armed struggle, they'd be attacking the regime at its strongest. Instead, by the use of nonviolent action in face of the Shah's repression, it was almost like Aikido or Jiu-Jitsu or some martial art, where he used the weight of the opponent against them. And that gives more sympathy for the movement and underscores that even the most authoritarian regime is ultimately dependent on the acquiescence of the people.
So there are several points looking at the history of Middle Eastern countries, just like what you did. The kingdomships have been having the more stable system and not a chaos compared to the republic. The power has been over to the hands of whether Islamists or the military in countries in Middle East. Interestingly, about Iran, these two got connected. And as you said, it was not only Islamists, the revolution, the Islamists party and the left. So these were the beginners, especially the left party. And then they claimed that the revolution got stolen from them, which is also something full of contradictions, since they had so much in common and they continue to have so much in common. So many of people who did take part in the revolution, now they confess somehow that it was a wrong act. Why there's so much misinformation about the system of Shah, where it was a progressive one? Just a simple comparison. For example, just look at the inflation. It was like 4 to 5%. Now look at it, it's more than 43%, and about food inflation is more than 70%, for God's sake. Right. So it's only one. And then look at the women's rights, like human rights in general. What was needed was reforms, not a revolution. And this is something that almost everybody is agreed on nowadays, that they talk of the revolution that happened. So many of lefties who took part, they also claim that it was wrong and it was only reforms that was needed.
I mean, there are certain aspects of the Shah's rule, including women's rights, that were certainly progressive, and there's certainly many aspects of the Islamic Republic in terms of the level of repression, especially on people's everyday lives, which is even worse than what was experienced under the Shah. But I think when you look at the climate in Iran in the 1970s, it's like today, in the sense that people wanted to have more democracy. They wanted to be able to express opposition to policy without fear of being murdered or jailed or tortured. And there were tens of thousands of political prisoners, and torture was widespread. I mean, the Savak was one of the nastiest secret police in the world. And this is documented by Amnesty International and other human rights groups. But the problem, I think, the main, and I guess I think that so people had good reason, for rebelling and really wanting to bring down the system. The problem, though, was that the Shah's repression was so thorough, and that he was able to crush, liberal, leftist, nationalist, secular opponents and their organizations. So many people fled into exile or were murdered or were jailed, that when the one group in Iran that really had a degree of was still able to operate, if you will, were the clerics. I mean, obviously he oppressed Islamists as well, but with the Ayatollahs and their networks, not just, of course, the mosques, but the schools, the social services, the medical facilities, the other things, that they ran. They were able. They had a social base by which they could take advantage of the power vacuum to come to dominate and control. And of course, the vast majority of Iranians then, as now, would have preferred to have a liberal democratic republic, not a monarchy and not a theocracy. But unfortunately, the clerics, had the upper hand in terms of the organizational capacity to seize control. And one can debate which was better, which was worse. Would have been better not to have had a revolution at all than to have suffered under what has come down the pike. But my strong sense is from at the time, and I was in the university at the time, and was very much in touch with there were a lot of Iranian students in the United States at that time, and as well as people I knew in Iran at that time, and there was what in hindsight was a naive hope that this would indeed bring a greater democracy. But it was a surprise for, in fact, the entire world, because back in those days, in the 1970s, people assumed that if you're going to have a revolution against the a right-wing U.S.-backed dictatorship, it was going to be an armed struggle. It's going to be leftist. It's going to start in the rural communities and then eventually surround the cities and take over by force, and then install in most cases, unfortunately, another dictatorship, usually of a Marxist orientation. But what we saw was there was it was an urban-based struggle. It was nonviolent largely, and it was led by these ended up being led by these reactionary Islamists. So it was a complete. It turned the conventional thinking about revolution at that time, on its head. And but but again, the initial desire, I think, for most people on the streets, was to create a more democratic republic, not an Islamic republic, or if it was an Islamic republic, one that would be loosely adopt the values of Islam, but not impose a theocracy in terms of oppressing women and religious minorities and the things that we have, of course, seen subsequently.
So what shall we do about the misinformation itself? When, for example, when somebody says that the Soviet killed so many, like thousands of Iranians and suppressed and tortured people, while there are not critical evidence, like actual evidence of torture done by the...
Oh, yes, there was. I mean, look at I know personally Iranians who were tortured, who had relatives who were tortured to death. If you look at Amnesty International reports and things like that.
But one thing is that many of those who did the interviews claiming that they were tortured.
در دوره شاه به دخترها خرس میانداختن.
هر چه 4 نفر جمع میشن براهنی میاد و زبونش در میاد. زبون منو ببینید، میلیسیدم. ترکی که مینوشتم ما رو برگن میلیسیدیم. آقا شما که حالا 90 سالت که نیست که حتما یه 40 سال همشاگرد داشت، 2 تاشو بیار شهادت بدم ببینیم تو کجا رو
خبرنگار نیویورک تایمز اومد به ایران به نام اریک پیس که هنوز هم خیال میکنم که در نیویورک تایمز باشه، رفته بود با شاه مصاحبه‌ای کرده بود و بعد خواسته بود که با یک کسی در سباک صحبت کنه و علازت هم گفته بودن که بیاد با من صحبت کنه. اومد اونجا با من صحبت کرد و اینها. اولین سوالی که کرد آقای رضا براهنی بود. گفتش که آقای رضا براهنی گویا اینجا زندانی بوده است و فلان ها. میگه که در زمانی که در زندان بوده اینو بسته بودن به یه پنکه‌ای و پنکه میچرخیده، در ضمن که میچرخیده یه نفر میخواسته به من تجاوز کنه در اونجا. من به این آقای خبرنگار گفتم والا شما به نظر میاد آدم معقولی هستید، این که اصلا همچین چیزی عملی هست که یه همچین ادعایی کسی
came out the information about them that they were lying and making stories to make everything.
Well, not the people, not the people I know, but I think the key thing we need to focus on, the thing to focus on now is to stop the torture, stop the oppression that's going on from the Islamic Republic.
But what's important also to make those things clear, because that the people nowadays in Iran, they shout out again the name of Shah. You know, they call out for Shah. They in the street of Tehran, for example, you know, the other day there was a like Muslim girl with complete hijab, you know, not even a non-Muslim one or anyone who's against Islam or anything like that, with a chador. She was standing bravely on the street and having a card in her hand written on it, "May the Shah be eternal." So, or Javid Shah, as Persians.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, you know, when I was last in Iran, you know, the dissidents I talked to were not talking about monarchical restoration. They were talking about democracy. They were talking about.
But the thing is that the democracy was not well known to these people. They were not after democracy, as we see. You know, no, just look at what they did. The left group and the Islamists got together to make this revolution. But how a person who's in his right mind can accept to have a leader as Khomeini, who already had written books obviously against human rights, against basic human rights, not even the new kind of rules about human rights or anything like that. He talks of touching infants, you know?
Yeah, no, like, I got it. You don't have to talk about the horrors.
What I'm saying is that it's completely out of sense to say that it was a surprise, that they couldn't expect that such a person or such a regime would start to kill people.
We saw similar naivety in Egypt. I mean, there are a lot of pro-democracy people who welcomed the initial coup.
You can never reach democracy by doing things against that. That's just.
Oh yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you 100%. But what I'm saying is that I think there is naivete. In hindsight, there's naivete about many of the activists on the streets about what would follow. But the goal of the majority of people, you know, was a more democratic system.
Yeah, and, but one thing is that the democracy was already there. People could speak out when, for example, when there was a court of a political prisoner, there was camera, journalists, they could report what were happening in the courtroom. While today, you have no idea what's happening to the prisoners, poor people who got fooled by the wrong promises of having free houses, free electricity, free gas, and free transportation, public.
آب و برق را مجانی می‌کنیم برای طبقه مستمند. اتوبوس را مجانی می‌کنیم برای طبقه مستمند. دلخوش به این مقدار نباشید.
I think we shouldn't also ignore the role, anyway, of the propaganda done by the, for example, British media, for example, BBC.
And the reason I brought that is that there's the supporters of the current regime deny agency to the Iranian people. And the point of that article was to say, no, this is not a Western imperialist plot. This is the Iranian people themselves who are rising up and struggling for their freedom, part of a long-standing Iranian tradition of doing so. And it is totally wrong to deny agency. And what we've seen in the various waves of protests in Iran in the past couple decades is that the initial resistance to the clerics it was centered on more middle class and secular elements in North Tehran and elsewhere. But what we're seeing in each wave of protest, you're getting more and more working class Iranians, more and more poor Iranians, including more and more religious Iranians, in that they recognize, I mean, in many ways, this reminds me of Eastern Europe in the 70s, when even people who consider themselves socialists saw that the communist governments were not socialist. They were just using socialism as an excuse to maintain their power. They were a self-selected, a corrupt, autocratic elite who were using the socialist rhetoric to justify their rule, even though by almost any objective standards it didn't really resemble true socialism. Similarly, more and more Iranians are recognizing that this is not about Islam. Even those who believe in an Islamic republic in principle.
We're not Muslim mostly, as we are recognized in the world. People protest more and more against this regime that has no belief actually in nationality. In your article, you also had mentioned Mir Hosseini Mousavi as a nationalist. I think it's wrong because, he was one of the members of the system. He is, he believes in this system, in this theocracy. So none of the mullahs, I just want to say, that are nationalists. They don't believe in nation. They just believe in ummah or ummat.
Well, yes, I certainly recognize that.
Yeah.
I think that the point being was I referred to him as a nationalist only to kind of counter the narrative of supporters of Ahmadinejad and others that the movement against the stolen election was somehow a Western plot, and that he was somehow being backed by Western powers, which is not true. No. But your underlying point that I think is one of the big hopes I have for Iran is that the people of Iran have a 2,500 year. You have at least 2,500 years of a strong national and cultural identity that is separate from Islam, that is separate from Islam, and that has a real power. I mean, the pride. I mean, it's that. I mean, and actually, when they have surveys of a sense of patriotism or nationalism, national identity. Persians come up in almost number one in the world because there are so many great things about the history, the culture to identify with. To have that supplanted by the opportunistic use of one interpretation of Islam is again very foreign, to the Iranian experience. And of course, some of the strongest resistance people have had is when the regime has tried to downplay that, like to try to minimize Nowruz and the celebrations of that associated with Iran's history. Now, at the same time, it's been interesting how the regime has in certain ways used manipulated nationalist views, to say, okay, we are defending our nation against Western imperialism.
Exactly.
And so, this is what actually gives me hope. I see Iran as kind of like Eastern Europe in the 70s. They're not quite at the point where they can bring down the regime, but the ideological hegemony is over. People just don't believe the rhetoric anymore, because of the history of civil resistance. Because of the strong sense of national pride, because of the increasing, despite all the hardships, educational levels, and new media technologies and everything. I do have faith that we will have a democratic Iran within a decade. I really think that the regime is not sustainable. And when we look at what happened in Syria, it was not as much the armed forces of al-Sham and the other armed resistance. It's the fact that the soldiers refused to fight, that the foundations of the regime crumbled because it did not have legitimacy among the people. It was more of a political collapse than a military defeat. Mm-hmm. And and it was so unexpected. I mean, people assume Assad had won, and just within a couple weeks, boom, it came crumbling like a house of cards. Non-cooperation, civil resistance, that really is where the power is. That's where you can undermine the authority, and because ultimately a government's only as powerful as its people's willingness to obey it.
Yeah, exactly true. Thank you so much.